Okay, so it's 10:05, and just in the interest of time, when I get started and also allow time to have a conversation, a discussion about lessons learned and things that you all who are here today have learned in your work with trade and technical colleges. So today's session, I'm excited to introduce Carly Rausch. Carly, am I saying your last name right?
Rush, yeah.
Um, and Carly is with ETR Associates, and she is our external evaluator here at CYN. So we're really excited to work with Carly. Some of the evaluation that our team is doing at CYN is focused on a lot of kind of systems and how things work, how policy governance works with different the systems that we work with, but then also we're really interested in learning a lot more about work with trade and technical colleges. So this is a relatively new area for us in the sense that we've only been learning a lot about trade and technical schools for the last few years. Prior to probably 3 years ago, much of our work focused on either the public schools or larger 4-year private universities, which operate very differently than the public schools. And so, as part of learning about trade and technical schools, we've collected information, knowledge, experience from our partners in the field. There's still so much more to collect from that perspective, but we also wanted to hear directly from trade and technical schools about just their governance and what might motivate them to be open to having a conversation around smoke and tobacco free policy issues on campus. And so that's something that Carly's been exploring, and we're really excited to hear the findings from her interviews and then have a conversation again to hear your lessons learned if you've been working with trade and technical colleges, and then talk about what are some next steps that we can start to do this work at the local or regional level. So I'll turn it over to you, Carly. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim, for the wonderful introduction. Greatly appreciate it. So I won't spend too much time talking about myself, but Kim has already done a fantastic job of introducing today's topic. But again, for those who just joined, my name is Carly Rosh. I work as an evaluator at an organization called ETR. ETR has quite a long history of working in California tobacco control, and I'm one of the evaluators for several of the funded projects, including working with CYAN. I actually would first like to take a minute and ask everyone, I'm actually going to stop sharing for a moment again, to use the reactions in the bottom bar. So if you scroll down to the bottom of the screen, you'll see a little smiley face with a plus symbol, and use any reaction you like to indicate, have you already started some work with trade and technical schools? Yeah, seeing some thumbs up. Okay, couple. Couple people. All right, great. So this is fantastic because this really will provide some introductory information, but then also have that focus on lessons learned. So terrific. All right, let me go back to sharing my screen. Okay. So as Kim mentioned, in today's presentation, we're really going to provide an overview of how we use these interviews to learn how select trade and technical schools develop and adopt policies. I'm going to actually explain the process we went through with these interviews in a little bit more detail as a way to really share those lessons learned on how to do this outreach for those of you who may be interested in doing so yourself in the future. I then am going to share some of the findings from those interviews. We are still finishing up a couple of them this month, and so we're going to continue to have more lessons learned as we go. And then we'll, as Kim mentioned, open up the session towards the end for everyone to have a chance to share lessons learned and to also discuss any other questions that you may have. So there are some really unique factors that impact how policy development looks in trade and technical schools. And I'm not going to go into this as much right now. This is something we could really talk through a bit more maybe in the open discussion. But in particular, in comparison to either K-12 schools or the larger public universities, There are some unique differences with these particular trade and technical schools. One is that these schools are often privately owned, they're privately operated. They might have a staff of 3 or 4 people, but they also might have a staff of hundreds or dozens. Students are often attending these schools for a much shorter period of time, and the locations can look very different between different schools. Some can be in a single standalone store, some are within outdoor malls, and then some might have their own dedicated campus or site. So when we started to talk about who we want to interview, we first really focused on what different types of technical and tech trade schools do we want to interview. CYN had actually selected a handful of some specific schools that we could conduct some cold outreach to. And those types of organizations were typically truck driving training schools, hair beauty salon, beauty schools, and for-profit or those private technical colleges. And there was also a couple nonprofit training organizations we were looking at as well. So once we had this kind of category, these different categories of schools identified, I also reached out to a few community-based organizations that I knew who really had strong workforce development programs. And I chose them because I thought they might have connections with other local businesses or other local folks in their particular towns or cities. And I could ask them for recommendations of people we could talk to about this. And I really do strongly recommend reaching out to some community based organizations that may be near the areas you're looking to work in, and even local government departments with help in identifying contacts at some of these types of schools. So, for example, I was introduced to the Santa Cruz County Director of Workforce Development Board, who works quite extensively with local businesses in the region. And this individual was able to suggest some specific people at the type of trade and tech schools we were looking at that we could interview. And this individual was also very helpful in providing direct contact information and was very willing to also be copied on any communications going forward. So it was what I call a little bit less cold of an outreach. And then while we knew we wanted to talk to the decision makers, we weren't really sure who those decision makers might be. And that was part of what we wanted to learn from these interviews. So in that case, I spent some time looking at the organizations and seeing, between their websites, LinkedIn, other online information I could find, who worked at these organizations and who would be most likely to talk about how a site operates or about policies generally. So I narrowed it down to a list of people that were in the roles of like operation managers or director of operations, of course, any owners, and anyone who seemed to be in kind of that position of talking about site operations policies. And then, of course, we had a couple people who were directly recommended by some of the community-based organizations I had reached out to. I do want to make one note that these interviews were calls and online discussions. As I won't go into this too much, but of course there was a number of closures across the state during the time when we were trying to do this, and wanting to do what we can to keep people safe. We couldn't walk into some of these schools and try talking to people or to kind of do those observations as easily as we might have otherwise had that not been the case. I want to talk a little bit about what I call like the pitch or the way we invited people to do these interviews. So for those people that came from recommendations, I of course explained who had recommended me. I explained that I was an evaluator researcher, and I explained that I was working on a project that was looking to learn more about how policies are developed or adopted at technical and trade schools. And then I actually would ask for a short introduction call to chat with them about the organization and our project. I then used the short introduction calls to really dive and explain more deeply about how we were looking to learn about policies, particularly smoke and tobacco related policies. For the cold outreach on our initial list, I primarily needed to call those sites directly, and typically there were one or two gatekeepers to kind of go through to get to the main person we were trying to interview. And in those cases, you really have a couple minutes to make that pitch and try to persuade them to have a longer conversation. So anyone who was willing to chat, it was either a matter of then conducting the interview right there or then, or scheduling a time for that later conversation. I do want to talk a little bit about the types of questions we asked. CYN and I, we worked together to develop a set of questions that we'd really like to know. These, though, were less structured interviews because we anticipated there would be a variety of different responses, and I would need to pivot and kind of follow that conversation as it went. So these conversations were really an open dialogue where I could emphasize that the focus was to hear from them about policy development and adoption and interest in going smoke and tobacco free. It was not at this time the point where I was providing a lot of education on smoke and tobacco free policies. The types of questions we asked, and I'll explain why we asked them very briefly, were, of course, first understanding from this person's perspective what their role was, because I wanted to hear how they see they fit within their organization. We also needed to ask a number of questions about how the site or facility was set up. So even though I could do a Google image search and I could see maybe or look on their website at a couple snaps, I needed to have a better understanding of, is this a standalone store? Is it part of a larger shopping area or campus? Do they have multiple locations, and how do those locations differ? And we also really needed to know if their site or building or space was rented or owned, because all these pieces could really impact how a policy could be adopted. I then would ask about the how changes in policies are typically discussed and who is typically involved in that process. And I really left it as I first left it as an open conversation about policy to really just better understand that process of what do they go through, what conversations do they have, who develops them, who approves them. And then I would ask more about, what does tobacco use look at their site? What policies do they have currently? And if they are having any conversations currently about smoking, and if there's been any complaints about tobacco. Again, these types of questions are really to try to understand from the interviewee's perspective, what is happening with tobacco use on that campus. Because as we know, one of the key elements and be able to do work with these schools in any school is really being able to address, what is that issue, and knowing where they start with that perspective is very helpful. So after having kind of a general understanding about policy development at their site and getting their perspective about tobacco use, I was then able to circle back around and really have a second conversation about not only if there was interest in going 100% smoke or tobacco free, but if they were to, how would that process be different than what we'd already talked about in that conversation? And we, of course, at the end, the final question was around, would they be interested in speaking more to CYAN in the future? I'm going to provide really just two high-level overviews of some of what we learned through these interviews. One interviewee worked at a truck and bus driver training school. The school has 3 sites in California, and the owner of the school owns 2 of the 3 buildings. And for the building that they don't own, they are looking at relocating in the future, but they have trouble in that particular region and finding a spot that really works for them. The buildings on these campuses are already, of course, non-smoking, but these campuses also have garages and other open areas that were also non-smoking. And the purpose for that was these other spaces were largely used for maintenance of the trucks and buses. And so, of course, there's oil, there's gas, there's quite a bit of flammable material. And so for safety reasons, those areas were also smoke-free as well. Uh, One thing that I found really interesting was that they really hadn't had many students come through who were smokers, and most of the faculty also were not smokers. Really, just one site in particular had a couple smokers, but they didn't really see this as a large issue on their campus. So in this case, they really had already set up an informal designated smoking area out in the parking lot. And one way that was a very interesting finding with this particular site was that the faculty or trainers in their training actually would talk about how when students in future are hired as truck or bus drivers, they are not going to be allowed to smoke in those trucks or buses, and they're not going to be able to smoke on school campuses. So there was already in their trainings this kind of encouragement about you will not be able to smoke. You're going to have to make sure you follow these rules that for non-smoking procedures. So it was a very interesting way to kind of connect tobacco control to this school. In this particular case, the trainers or faculty members are largely the ones to suggest changes to policies or operation to the owners. And they typically would have these conversations in staff meetings or in kind of specifically set up meetings. And a tobacco control related policy, of course, would be seen as an operational or company level policy. And it would also need input from their safety department. And the owners would then ultimately need to approve any new company level policies. So while the school is having some conversations about smoking and smoking policies, they're not really sure what other resources would really be helpful because they're not necessarily seeing this as a large scale issue, but they were open to talking with CYAN on this in the future, though they were not ready to commit to going 100% smoke and tobacco free. I'm going to briefly talk about one more example. Another interviewee worked at a kind of private college and actually had previously worked with CYN before to go smoke and tobacco free. And in this case, there was actually a champion who was interested in pursuing this goal. And the champion worked with what they had as an internal compliance committee who was really there to help develop and draft policies for the school. The school then had an executive leadership team that was really that over site, and that leadership team would meet weekly. So in this case, the champion presented the issue of tobacco and smoking and the benefits of going smoke and tobacco free at one of those weekly meetings, along with the proposed policy. And the leadership team at that meeting approved it there and they went then set forth in actually implementing it and working through compliance. The students and other faculty were really not involved in the policy development piece, but they were part of helping let people know it had been implemented and helping provide education and resources on the new policy. So they would speak in classes or share information at fairs. It's on the website. It's in several places. I think there were a number of really good lessons learned from these interviews, and we're only continuing to learn more. I, of course, took away that this process of development of a policy and approval could be a very short time frame, and it could really involve very few individuals. However, and I don't think that this one was surprising to any of us, is that each school and site could have a very different process for how policies are adopted. And I think what this just emphasized is that there isn't a shortcut to having a method that will work broadly for everyone necessarily. I mean, in this case, in the examples I just share, one place staff are heavily involved in conversations, and in the other, they're not as much. And another one that I just wanted to emphasize is that because these are relationships being built, it really can take 3 or 4 different conversations to get momentum going and find a way to connect that tobacco control education into items that they're already doing. Of course, this outreach and any relationship building can be very time intensive. So it's helpful to kind of plan that to be the case. And then from the evaluation perspective, I thought it was helpful to really have these conversations be this open dialogue and to really emphasize that the focus was to hear from them about policy development and their interests. As Kim mentioned, we wanted to use some time today to really actually have an open session on lessons learned. I have a couple prompts on the screen, though I'd actually like to invite Kim to speak on any other lessons learned and any other factors that are helpful with these conversations with tech and trade schools.
Thanks so much, Carly. Yeah. So as Carly had mentioned, I think one of the hardest parts with the trade and technical schools is that a lot of the lessons learned might be really specific to one type of college. Some of the challenges that we have that are so different from working with public colleges and universities, again, just kind of repeating some of the things, these are private entities. Essentially, they are businesses. And so the voices of the people who are um, part of the business, or maybe the students, in some sense might have carry a lot of weight, but it's really critical to find out who the decision makers are and who they're listening to most. And that, unfortunately, is not something that you can learn from a system level. It really is about having those conversations. The other challenges Carly mentioned was just how quickly people come and go within the trade and technical colleges. And so oftentimes we experience this with community colleges where we only have students there usually for 2 years or so, and they come and go, and by the time you get student partners they then move on to something different. And so that's even more so with the vocational schools. And so it's trying to figure out from the decision makers what it is that we can connect tobacco to so that they can think that it's a priority issue. And so oftentimes it is that student success, right? They bring students in because they have a very specific task of preparing students for a job, a very specific job. And so if we can connect tobacco free living to that occupation, that's really, really successful. So it's a lot of buy in from the campus to do that work. With that, though, the challenge that we have that's a massive challenge is that these schools don't have student health centers unless they're larger institutions. They don't have tobacco treatment services. They don't have a student health center representative who can go and can talk to students. So this is where, as community partners, our relationships are so important because those are things that we can offer them. We can offer, if they're having events on campus when they're back on campus, to be able to come and to table and give out free quick hits, or to give them resources from the helpline or from um, our local health department or whoever it might be. So constantly offering ourselves as resources to support the work that they're doing. Carly had mentioned Unitech College, which is the campus, the institution that we worked with to go smoke and tobacco free. And really, the way that we got connected was because they needed our resources. They needed our funding to help pay for signage, and they needed some of the support and the knowledge to be able to offer that. So we were able to come in from that angle. And so, and other big lessons learned that have been a challenge, as Carly had mentioned with one of the campuses, not all of these schools own the property of which they are working with. And this is also something that we deal with a lot when we're doing strategy sessions with faith-based communities, because your decision maker is going to be obviously the person from the trade and tech school, but another decision maker may be the owner of the buildings. And so then you have to convince the people that are leading the trade and technical schools to change the policy, but then you have to get buy-in from the owners of the property and the building. And so what we're looking at doing is really trying to start essentially with the lowest hanging fruit. So finding those those vocational schools that have standalone spaces. And so you're only working in those spaces. And oftentimes it may just be a building with a parking lot. And so recognizing that you're working there, because if you start off working with a school that is in a strip mall, now you're dealing with not just the school, but you're dealing with all of the businesses in the strip mall. There might even be a tobacco or vape shop in that strip mall. So now your opposition looks really different. So that's something huge. So our partners at Breathe California, when they were doing this work a few years ago, what they did was they just printed out a list of all of the campuses. They also looked to see if those schools were still open, because that's another challenge, is a lot of these schools, especially right now with COVID and the cost of the student fees, many of the schools kind of come and go. And so pulling up that list of the campuses in your community, looking at which campuses are accredited. So there's a California accreditation board. It's called the Western Association of School Accreditation, WASC. So you can pull up and see who's accredited. If they're accredited, they're much more likely to still be uh, operating because they've gone through the accreditation process, and then picking up the addresses from those schools. And if you live in a space where you're able to drive, driving and looking at what do those campuses look like. And then if you can't, we recognize a lot of counties are massive and it would take you hours to drive. So if that's the case, pull up Google Maps and use the little icon where you can drop and look at what the campus looks like. So you can see what's around the campus, if there's other businesses around the campus. And that's been a really helpful strategy, just to narrow it down and find out who on the campus or which campuses you can work with. And then, as Carly mentioned, a lot of it is cold calling and just starting those relationships. And that, I mean, that's something that we had to do with the public schools too. This is just our work in tobacco control as community partners, but reaching out and just leading with, hey, we're a community partner, we're interested in learning, we work on tobacco control. We would love to be able to support your students and your staff there and make sure they have access to tobacco treatment services. We have free resources. Developing the relationship that way versus leading with, we want to make your campus smoke and tobacco free, because they'll probably just close the door right there with that. So those are a lot of the things that we've learned. We've really had to shift our focus from a shared governance model, which is what the public schools work with, and look more from a business model and how to work with these businesses to protect their students and their staff as well. And I would say the last thing is really just looking at it from an employee perspective. As I mentioned in the last presentation, the UC system really framed their policy as a employee wellness piece, that this was really something from a healthcare perspective to keep costs down by supporting their people and not having high insurance premiums, and making sure that their employees weren't out sick more often because they were tobacco users, that they weren't off on really long breaks because they were constantly taking breaks to go use tobacco. So from that employee wellness perspective of angling it that way versus some of the other traditional topics that we talk about preventing students from using and secondhand smoke exposure. So those are the lessons that we've learned thus far with trade and tech schools. Again, we're really at the infancy of this work, and I would say one of the hardest parts with these campuses and with private schools in general is that you have to learn each of the campuses individually versus having a concept of what the governance looks like from a system level. And then, but I think one of the things I saw, some comments in the general session on trade and tech schools. Would just love to hear from those of you who've already started to work with vocational schools, just even started that outreach or started to explore the work with these campuses, what you've learned thus far, what some of the successes or the challenges are. And you can just unmute.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Ashley, and I'm a health educator at America on Track. And along with me is my colleague, Alejandra Cook. So we both are dealing with technical and vocational schools. Pre-COVID, what we started doing before all COVID happened was we started doing in-campus visits. And we started selling it as free resources, letting them know, we have these free resources. We could give your campus free quick kits. It's just something for the students. And we ended up realizing that the person that we needed to speak to was the student engagement coordinator or someone in student services. Sometimes they're called like career services director. So when I was first going in, since I didn't really have a specific person that I was able to speak to, the receptionist just told me to leave some information and that I wasn't getting any calls back. But then I started realizing that the person that I needed to ask for was like someone in student services. So that did help us get into contact with some of the trade schools, but at the same time it was kind of some of them it with some of them it was difficult because they have a corporate. So for instance, like Northwest College, it's a big college. I know they have colleges throughout the state, and they have one over here in Anaheim, but their corporate was in West Covina. So with the student engagement coordinator there, she had told us that, she was interested in implementing a policy, but it was gonna all be up to corporate. Um, so that has helped us knowing that someone in student services is who we need to speak to, because now with COVID, when we're making calls, we asked to speak to someone in student services and offer our resources. I know that now they've been telling us that it's hard because now everything's virtual. They don't get students on the campus. They don't have any. They don't even. They say that there's no flow of students. Who would they give the stuff to? So they said that we are getting some that are saying that now is not the time, but have gotten some that have been interested. And what we've been offering is shipping our quick kits, letting them know that any students or staff that would like quick kits, we can ship them for free. And we also did create some educational folders for the campuses, and now we're also offering those as well as the bookmarks. So that is something, but again, it's kind of it's whether the school wants the resources or whether they don't. Usually with those in the medical field, we have realized that they're more interested because like I had said in the general chat, that's where I learned that some of the schools do get drug tested and asked about tobacco use. And um, there's that has been a benefit because some have said yes because of that, but then also some have said no because they said our students can't smoke anyways. So it goes both ways. But that has been our work.
That's awesome, Ashley. I appreciate you sharing. I have a lot of questions for you. So you had mentioned that you were working with some of the medical campuses. Is there a specific like nursing or on the medical tech side? Which campuses are you working with?
Yeah, so we had worked with Northwest College, and they were a college that was training for medical assistants, dental assistants, and that kind of field. And then we were working with another university called South Balo, and they were for acupuncture. So they focus more on acupuncture. Currently, we are working with a school called Modern Technology School, and they are, I believe it's medical techs. They do a lot of like ultrasounds and that kind of training.
Okay, perfect. And then you had mentioned that they're testing students for drug use and for tobacco use. So is there a policy that their students cannot be tobacco users? Do you know if if that's a policy?
I'm not sure. I do know that some of the student services or engagement coordinators I've spoken to have said that when they apply to the school, they need to get drug tested, and that's something that they tell them. I'm not sure if it's part of one of their policies or.
Okay.
I know in the case of the bus driving side, They also mentioned drug testing, but they weren't really focused on tobacco. It was really specific to marijuana use and other drugs. And part of that was these drivers, the bus drivers for schools can continue to be tested once they're in the work too. So it certainly is a very interesting one. I'm so glad you brought up that point of testing. I find it so fascinating that some are focusing on tobacco as well, and then others are not. So thank you for sharing that.
Sorry, this is Alejandra Cook. One thing that I actually forgot to mention that we just about 2 years ago we started working with trade schools and vocational schools. We were fortunate enough that before COVID we got Taller San Jose, which is a big trade school campuses here in Orange County, and they have 3 different locations: one in Santa Ana, 2 in Santa Ana, and 1 in Anaheim. And they did decide to go smoke free. And even though one of their locations was part of a big building where they do like therapy, which this is the funny part, they do therapy and drug abuse substance. And another side of the building, the building did decide to go smoke free because Taller San Jose was going smoke free at the time. And then we also work with Modern Technology, and they decided also to go smoke free during COVID time because they figure that, hey, our students are going to come back eventually, might as well come back to a tobacco free campus. So it's been difficult, but at the same time, we've been learning about what is it that they want. We leave it up to them and we say, we can do whatever you guys decide to do as long as, we follow the rules that, yes, it's going to be 100% smoke free, but we can take it slowly at a time and offering a lot of free services. So we did offer the free signs to them so they didn't have to worry about, and Ashley has been doing a lot of social media posts. So the schools are just able to upload right away whenever they're ready. And once a month, Ashley just gives them resources. So anything, she's been able to keep the relationship with the people that might just be interested or just want more information. And once a month, she just sends out those resources for them. And sometimes they post, sometimes they don't, but at least the information is there and it's going out there for them.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. So just some more follow-up questions for both of you, and just a comment about, it's interesting with the drug testing, and makes sense, especially what Carly you just shared, because if they're going into workplaces where they're also going to be tested, it makes sense that they'll continue to be tested, which I think could make a really good case for the advocacy work of, if people are coming in as tobacco users, it's really important to create smoke and tobacco free spaces and then offer them the resources. One thing that's interesting, and unfortunately we don't have any current data, but the last time CTCP collected data on who is using tobacco by education level, students who attended trade and technical colleges had the highest rates of tobacco use of any population, individuals who didn't graduate from high school graduates, college, and so forth. So I think, it's such an important population to work with. We have found with some of the work with private schools and with specifically really religious schools, usually a Catholic school or a Christian school, they'll have policies that prohibit students from using alcohol, tobacco, and other drugs. And so students sign these things saying that they will not use. And because of those policies, schools say, well, we don't need to have another policy because students aren't supposed to be using the products. But those use policies don't cover the employees of the institutions. And so talking about how, the norming and all of that is super important. So I'm wondering in terms of, so 2 things. One is, especially since students are virtual, do you know the platform that the campus is using to provide that education? Like, are they using Canvas or another platform that you would be able to get your information and content to the students through?
I am not sure what platform they use, but I do know that the person that we are in contact with does like email blasts. So they'll do like email blasts to the students and then just let them know if you need a free quick kit, reach out to Jessica from Career Services. And then she will reach out to us and let us know the name of the student and then what their address is and with all of their contact info. So that's how they've been doing it so far.
And have you had a lot of students request quick kits?
Yeah, we have had a couple of students request quick hits, especially because we are letting them know that we are shipping them. So a few have been interested. And then also whenever we send like those social media posts, the school will post like, oh, contact Jessica if you would like a free quick hit. And something we've also done, something we did with Modern Technology School is we did give them quick hits to have on campus so that then she can just distribute it to students, and then whoever she distributes to, she lets us know.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. And I'm gonna, yes, and Angie just shared that finding out who does the email blasts, that's a great connection to have. I agree, Angie, that is a really great. I'm taking notes furiously. I know we have about 4 minutes left, so I want to open it up to any other questions that anybody might have for Ashley and Alejandra or for Carly, or if anybody else wants to share more about the local work that you may be doing with vocational campuses. You can go ahead and mute yourself or put something in the chat box. And while we're waiting, Ashley or Alejandra or Carly, if you have anything else, any tidbits or lessons learned that you want to share with the group.
Is there anything, Alex?
No, well, one thing that has been hard for us is getting public opinion poll surveys. And before COVID, the schools would invite us and say, oh, come to all of the classes. Well, all of the classes are just 3 classrooms, right? Sometimes, and it might be like 20 students. But to them, that was like, this is our whole school.
Yeah.
And I know that, I don't know, but for our CTCP project, they asked for 100 public opinion polls per school. And that just seemed like, oh my God, when are we gonna get those 100 public opinion poll surveys? So we tried targeting everybody that was at school in the morning because they have different shifts, right? The morning shift and the evening shift. And one day we were there all day and all we got was like 45 surveys. But during COVID time, as we were telling them, like, we can do virtual presentations, we can give you information, like doing a table lean online and showing them, and even doing surveys like that was really hard for us. So I don't know if anybody else is doing public opinion poll surveys. Like, the most that we gotten through emails was like 10, I think. So it's been really, that's one of the things that it has been challenging for us. And we've done raffles for gift cards and just try to incentivize them without making it seem that we were paying for the survey if people were giving it back to us. But just if you guys have any ideas on that, or how we can figure this out.
It's a great conversation. I know we only have a couple minutes left, so I'd be happy to talk more with you on this afterwards as well. We're certainly, especially in the past year, the public opinion polls I've done for different CTCP projects have just, rates have just been at really, really low. It's been so difficult, even just as you said, if you have incentives. So what we've tried to do is, in the meantime, yes, still keep these surveys open, sharing them across all the organizational communications, whether that's, as you said, in the email blast, through social media, pushing through using ad money, those kinds of things. We've also just tried to use other techniques, try to do more interviewing, more focus grouping, just really and if you have a chance to be on campus again, that might be something to consider as well, is to see, like, is there a way that can be an open forum conversation in the last part of a course? Or can it be something that is like embedded? If it is already part of some of the training content, can this conversation kind of come out as part of that too? But I can absolutely, I absolutely understand the tricky part with polls right now. It's been very hard to get numbers.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Carly, and thank you everybody for joining the session. I appreciate the sharing so much. Lots of really good lessons learned. We are at kind of at the beginning of a very big task. When we look at the number of private schools in trade and tech, there are over 1,000 in California. So we have a lot of work to do, but it's really important work. You all are really the ones like starting this work. There's not many people doing it. So appreciate the lessons learned and excited to see where we get with this movement with trade and tech schools. So the next step, we have a 5-minute break between now and 10:55, and then just go back to that link that we shared earlier today, and then join the next session that you're interested in. And we'll see you, if not in the next session, then the closing session afterwards. So thanks so much, everybody.
Yes, thank you, everyone.